Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. By far the game of the week, Georgia heading on the road to play Ole Miss. And Dill, this football game for me, specifically from an Ole Miss lens, it feels like a college football playoff playing game. Like if Ole Miss can get this one done at home against Georgia, love their opportunity and chance to make the college football playoffs. But I think more importantly, love their ability to be extremely dangerous if they do get to the college football playoffs. What should excite Ole Miss fans the most is that this is an Ole Miss team that we've seen the last 2 weeks that looks like the team that we thought we were going to get heading into 2024. And then you're going up against a Georgia team that we just ain't used to having this many question marks about a Georgia team in the month of November than we have heading into this matchup. Really excited to get into. I think this game's fascinating from a couple of different matchup standpoints. Really excited to get into it now. Before we do, and as always, I think most importantly, let it fly in the comments section. A lot of different ways that you can look at this football game. Dill, I don't think we agree on our picks as well, so we're going to get a little bit of a battle in. I fully expected Georgia and Ole Miss fans to be battling out in the comment section as well. That's what makes the sport of college football the best sport on the planet. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dill, without further ado, I think we got to start with this matchup. A Georgia offense that continues to have a ton of question marks, mostly around quarterback Carson Beck, going up against an Ole Miss defense that, I'll say this, there ain't many better defenses in the country than what Ole Miss has. And I feel like it's just a unit that's flying under the radar because whenever we talk about this Ole Miss team, we talk about Lane Kiffin, we talk about Jackson Dart, the explosive offense. Dill, what makes this team special in 2024 is on the defensive side of the football. Go back 12 months ago when Ole Miss lost by a large margin against Georgia in Athens. Lane Kiffin gets in front of the microphone and says, we just don't have the guys that look like the guys Georgia has on the line of scrimmage. You fast forward 12 months, they do. Heading into this football game, I think it's going to be a massive storyline. What are some of the big matchups we're looking at between this Georgia offense going up against an Ole Miss defense that is one of the best units in the country so far in 2024?
To me, this is probably the most important game for those high-impact transfer guys that we've talked about. Where was Ole Miss kind of lacking? You saw them start to build up some physicality in the trenches, even as much as last year. Like guys like J.J. Peggy's, guys like Jared Ivey, like you started to see them physically look a little bit more the part, but you didn't have a ton of guys who are making big plays and high-impact plays. Now you've got Walter Nolan, you've got Princely U, J.J. Peggy's is playing that way, Sontarian Perkins playing that way. They're starting to create those TFLs, those negative plays, those sacks. And to me, when you look at how you want to play or how Georgia, I think, is going to want to play this game, it's going to be probably similar to how Kentucky tried to play this Ole Miss team, where they're going to try to get on long drives. Because, again, that is what has slowed Ole Miss's offense down. When they can't get into a rhythm and play fast like they were against Arkansas, you haven't seen a great version of Ole Miss's offense. I think they're going to try to suck the life out of this game. And that, to me, is where you need your big dogs to step up and make a couple of plays to get George off schedule and force Carson Beck into some spots he hasn't played, frankly.
You highlighted two of probably the biggest storylines in this football game, and I think it's one, how is this game played? Like, you could cover up the end of the scoreboard for me, and just tell me how many drives did each team have? Was it closer to 13 to 15 drives each? I'd probably say Ole Miss wins that football game. If it's closer to 10, I'm probably saying Georgia won that football game. This seems like how does this game look? How does this game play? I think has a massive impact on the outcome. Dill, you said it best. What makes this Ole Miss team special is the negative plays they've created. You go back to the Oklahoma game, 10 sacks, 15 TFLs. You go to the Arkansas game, 8 sacks, 13 TFLs. There's not been a better program across the country at creating negative plays than this Ole Miss front seven. And if you can get Georgia into those second and third and long situations, Dill, it's been a bad offense. They've been very, very bad on third down. They're only converting 37% of their third downs, largely because they've struggled on first and second down. If you can get Carson Beck in this Georgia offense off schedule, let Ole Miss pin their ears back and get after the passer, two things come into play. One, Carson Beck's been brutal under pressure. I mean, you go back to that Florida game, under pressure, he was 1 of 8 for 8 yards and 3 interceptions. That was something that made Carson Beck so good in 2023. He's really struggled this year. I think, secondly, Carson Beck is significantly better coming off play action than he is just dropping back. If you can create those second and third and long situations, guess what? Play action, not nearly effective. The success rate for Georgia on first and second down seems like a massive storyline in this football game. And I think it comes down to, hey, can Georgia run the football? They got a little bit of life in the run game with the true freshman Nate Frazier, who I think is a special running back. Can they run the football against an Ole Miss front seven that
Because
is
Nate
allowing?
Frazier gives them that like real aggressive downhill slashing kind of style that, again, you look when Georgia's running game is working, I think they do a good job of staying on schedule. And ETN, it's not to take anything away from what he does, but he's a little bit more of a big play kind of
Nate
maker.
Frazier's been the better back by far.
And especially for what Georgia wants to do in terms of being able to keep themselves on schedule and avoid those kind of 0-yard gains, 2-yard gains. Like Nate Frazier hasn't been particularly explosive. I mean, he hasn't reeled off really any big runs. He did obviously in the past game against Clemson for one, but he's done a really good job of keeping them on schedule. That's the big thing. I feel like we look at the explosive plays, you certainly want those, but Georgia's style of play, I think, works better when the running backs are kind of setting the floor at 4 yards and they can just kind of pound on you.
Well, Kirby Smart says it himself. Like, why do you run the football? You run the football to stay on schedule a little bit, but I think most importantly, prevent an Ole Miss defense from just pinning the ears back and getting after the passer. Georgia's and you're right. I disagree with your take on Nate Frazier because I know this kid out of Mater Dei. Like, he can be a hell of a lot more explosive than you're giving him credit for, but with Nate Frazier's ability to get some of the hard yards and keep Georgia out of those second and third and long situations, that's going to be a huge storyline in this game.
Because again, like you saw the way Kentucky was able to suck the life out of that football game. That to me, if in Georgia should be Georgia's better version of that. Their offensive line's better. It's finally gotten healthy. I think they're playing good football for the most part, especially in the run game. Was very impressed with what they did against Texas, especially. That to me, like they get that version of their offensive line, they stay up, they avoid those type of penalties and the negative plays, which again is no easy task when you're playing Ole Miss because they've been dynamite in making them. I think Georgia can have a lot of success just generically in this football game, playing it on their terms.
All right, let's flip the sides here. Ole Miss offense versus Georgia defense. And I'll start with this. To me, it almost depends on like, hey, what version of the Georgia defense do we get? Do we get the version that we saw against Clemson? Do we get the version we saw against Texas? Like Georgia's defense has been solid all year, but we've seen dominant versions of Georgia and we've seen just solid versions of this Georgia defense. What version do we get? I think is number one. Obviously, the chess match between Lane Kiffin and Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann. Get your popcorn ready for that one, as Lane Kiffin would say. This Ole Miss offense, look, we talked about it yesterday, and I'm not going to get up here and say this Ole Miss offense is better without Trey Harris. It seems more healthy without Trey Harris. They're much less reliant on, hey, we're just going to throw some verts to Trey Harris and hope for the best. They finally realized they got 5-6 other legitimate playmakers in this offense. The ball's getting out everywhere. I mean, you look at Jackson Dart, 25 of 31 for 515 yards, 6 touchdowns, the same amount of incompletions as touchdown passes against Arkansas. I think the biggest question here is, do we continue to get that version of this Ole Miss offense where we're getting Daquan Wright involved, who is a difference maker at tight end, where we're getting Jordan Watkins and Caden Lee involved, Juice Wells involved. Look, Trey Harris, though, might have a massive impact on this football game because whereas Georgia struggled the most in the secondary with some vertical passes where the defensive backs have to get their head around and go make plays on the football, that's the Trey Harris specialty. I think my question here is, you feel like Trey Harris is going to play. You feel like they sat Trey Harris so he could be 100% for this football game. Can you take your shots at Trey Harris? Can you hit those shots, but not be over-reliant on wide receiver Trey Harris? That's kind of the storyline, the question mark that I have for this Ole Miss offense going up against this Georgia defense.
Can they work some of that underneath stuff that, frankly, you go back, I imagine – Ole Miss is going to want to play a similar style to Alabama. And I know Jackson Dart's not quite the athlete or obviously not the athlete that Jalen Milroe is, but I think they're going to want to spread them out because, again, they can't get into a rock fight in between the tackles. You look like this Ole Miss offensive line certainly improved. It's not a great SEC unit. I wouldn't say they don't run the ball particularly well, especially when they got to do it physically. So I think they're going to want to get them spread out. That to me is where you need to be able to get some of those high percentage, easy access throws to avoid being in 2nd and 10 and 3rd and 10 too consistently. Because it did feel like in certain games where Ole Miss, what you said, wasn't taking kind of what the defense was giving them to an extent. They were getting backed up. they were getting into some bad spots, and their offense just wasn't clicking kind of the way.
And you don't want to be in that position against Georgia. Like the third line, and you're kind of right. Like Ole Miss's offensive line and pure pass protection against this Georgia pass rush, you don't want to be in those situations very often. So I'm kind of with you. Look, I'm not asking for Ole Miss to run the football for 200 yards here. And quite frankly, Ole Miss has done a really good job running the football to set up some of the stuff in the passing game. Like, I think Ole Miss knows they're not going to run the football extremely effective against this Georgia front seven, but can you run it enough to open up some of those RPOs where you're getting a guy like Daquan Wright taking over the middle? Because we all know these Georgia linebackers, when they see run, they're firing down. Can you sneak Daquan Wright behind those backers, get him the football in space?
And also, I still think Georgia's going to want Malachi Starks back playing more of a deeper safety role because, again, you really don't love the matchup with Trey Harris one-on-one against these corners, especially Humphreys. That's probably where they're going to try to get him to because Humphreys has struggled playing the ball in the air. I mean, Everett has a little bit too, but certainly that's been an issue. And if you have that matchup with Trey Harris too often, that's certainly going to be an issue. So I think they're going to probably want Malachi Starks back a little bit more to deal with that. And that to me is where Jackson Dart needs to be able to like be comfortable, not just taking shots and scoring really, really quickly and just being able to kind of methodically work down the field because they have the weapons to do it. I mean, Caden Lee's played really well in the slot for them. Daquan Wright, I think, adds a new element at that tight end spot. So again, they're not going to run the ball successfully, I don't think, in this game, Ole Miss, that is. I think they're going to need to almost use that short intermediate or short yardage passing.
The extension of the passing or the extension of the run game. Well, 100%. And I mean, we're talking all these X's and O's. It's going to come down to a fair amount of, hey, can Jackson Dart make the plays down the field? Because you know Ole Miss is going to take their shots. And when this Ole Miss offense is humming and putting up 60 points a game, it's because Jackson Dart's hitting those throws.
See, when you said that, I thought you were going to say it comes down to what this Ole Miss offensive line actually is, because we've seen this before where Ole Miss has looked good against teams that are a little bit lesser. I mean, Georgia's defensive line against Texas, like that's a game. They play that game. That's a problem for everyone. And again, Ole Miss, like I've said it, I think this offensive line is much better than it was last year. You look guy to guy, they're just individually bigger, stronger, better players. But we kind of thought that, like, okay, what could Ole Miss do last year? And Georgia kind of ran them off the road a little bit. You look, I mean, that still to me is going to be the fundamental question is what this offensive line can do against the Georgia defensive line, especially if they're kind of humming the way they were humming against Texas.
I don't think Ole Miss's offensive line dominates that matchup there, but it needs to be good enough for Jackson Dart to operate. And you're right. Like Jackson Dart, when he's kept clean, 80% completion percentage. When he's under pressure, 45%. Is it, I guess for me, the question is like, is it going to be a liability or not? Like, I don't think Ole Miss's offensive line is going to dominate in terms of blocking this Georgia front seven. I don't think there's many. We just saw the best offensive line in the country, Texas, get smoked by this Georgia pass rush. But can you be good enough where Jackson Dart has his opportunities?
And it can't be what it was last year. Like last year, they just weren't in the world that they needed to be in. Again, I think Ole Miss's players are better, but still they're going to have to go prove it because like they haven't really seen a Georgia. I mean, Kentucky's certainly a good front seven, but it's not Georgia's.
Yeah, and we saw Kentucky get after them a little bit. I mean, like Kentucky was rushing 3, dropping 8, and still getting pressure on this Ole Miss team. If you're Georgia, that's probably how you want it to look, where you can drop 8-7 into coverage and still impact Jackson Dart, who's significantly not as good of a passer when he's heated up. Let's get into the pick here, Dill. Ole Miss 2.5-point dogs at home against Georgia. Where are we going with this?
Give me the dogs. I just think Georgia can play the style that Kentucky played them and just do it at a much higher level. Again, Carson Beck's turnovers are certainly scaring me. It just feels like he's like a magnet to throwing picks right now. That is giving me some cause pause, but I do think Georgia can play the style that can give Ole Miss a lot of problems in this football game.
Yeah, give me Ole Miss here. And it's like an eyeball test game. And look, I like taking or betting against Georgia in the month of November? No, absolutely not. Probably get my head cut off. That being said, this Georgia team has so many question marks. They're not playing their best football. Ole Miss at home, they're playing their best football that they've had all of 2024 and again, the difference between this football game is I don't think Georgia's going to have as much success playing that bully ball because this front seven for Ole Miss, they're dudes this year. And then quite frankly, Georgia's rushing attack hasn't been what we've seen over the past couple of years for that reason, for the difference of kind of bodies Ole Miss finally has along the defensive line and in the front seven, give me Ole Miss here. And if they win this, like I think they're a college football playoff team. I think they kind of roll through the rest of their schedule and they're going to be dangerous. And we might see this game again in the college football playoffs. We'll sign out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it again. This one is going to be a blast. The amount of support means the world. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.